Thank you so much, Renu. So I'll start with, we are a result of the choices we make in life. I hope we all agree with that. Yes? And to have good choices, we need to have good pool of options, right? So as developers and as leaders, we can't afford to be left behind when we are updating our technology wardrobes, and we must be aware about the options we have available. We should know about the latest trends, and then we need to choose and tailor them accordingly, according to the needs and our wants. A Java developer for the last 18 years, Java doesn't fail to excite me even today. It is definitely moving forward and faster. And now it has a new release cadence, which is 6 months. So instead of having a new Java release every 3 to 4 years, which was the way it was released earlier, we have a new version of Java every 6 months, which is exciting. So the rate of innovation hasn't changed at Oracle, the rate of delivery has. Now developers like us can access the newest features every 6 months. So I'm here to talk about Project Amber at Oracle, which is in works, which is talking about advancements in one direction. There's so many dimensions in which Java is moving forward. I could talk about Project Loom, which talks about finer threads, so to make your applications more responsive. We could talk about Project Panama, where we talk about using the APIs, which is written in the other languages. So all the Python and PHP programmers out there, you can make awesome libraries, and we would be able to use that easily, right? And we can also talk about a lot of other projects which are in work at Oracle, but now I would stick only to Project Amber. So quick introduction about me. I work with JetBrains as a developer advocate, helping developers adopt the tools better, work better with the language which are used with those IDEs. I have authored a couple of books, 4 to be precise. I am also founder at ejavaguru.com, where I help students and professionals earn their Java certifications. I also lead 2 communities in Delhi. One is Women Who Code, and the other one is the Delhi Java User Group. And I'm also one of the Java champions recognized by Oracle. We just have around 275 Java champions across the globe, and I'm one of them. So this is the official page of, a reminder that these 2 screens are the same. So it's just how the projectors are, so you could look at either of them. Okay. So this is the official page on Project Amber at Oracle. So if you would try to Google it, so this is the page you would land at. So it talks about a lot of JEPs, which is the Java Enhancements Proposals. So each JEP talks about addition to a Java language feature or improvement about it. So Project Amber talks about the exploring incubation of smaller productivity oriented Java language features. I know that's a bit difficult to understand, so let's understand that in easy way. You can think of Project Amber as a bigger project, or like an umbrella, where smaller features are being talked about and being worked on. So let's say some of the language features which were recently released is var with Java 10. Which version are you working on? 8? 8. Okay, 9, 10, anyone? Okay. So I would be covering new language features which are added with Java 10 and later. So I would be skipping 9 because Project Amber was started in 2017, which is post Java 9. So we're talking about var, which came in Java 10. We talk about text blocks, which is about to be released with Java 13, which is due for release next month, 17th to be precise, and a couple of other features as well, and I would cover all of them as we move forward with the session. So if you take a note of the ones which are highlighted, those are the preview language features. So, because the release cadence has changed now with Java, Oracle releases the language features as preview language features, so that developers can try out those features and submit their feedback if they have so. Because we are talking about changes to the language, and any feature that goes into the language cannot be taken off. So, if developers are working on it, if there is any major issues or minor issues, you can of course report that to Oracle, and Oracle seriously takes that into consideration, because recently a couple of features were changed after the feedback was received from the developers. So, that is the most important question for the session. Why should you care about Project Amber? Unlike an API or a framework, you cannot ignore Project Amber, because it is going to change how you read or write your everyday code in Java. Even if you ignore using the features while you are writing the code, you would someday have to read the code which has been written by other developers which use these features. So, even if you do not write code using the new features, you would have to read the code which uses the new features. So, this is crucial. So, if you are working in Java, you must be aware of these changes. Just in case if my statement was not scary or encouraging enough, here are some of the examples. So, prior to Java 10, so the upper part of the slide shows how you would define your local variables with an explicit data type, but with Java 10 you could use var, which is a reserved keyword, and this is how your humble switch statement has changed with Java 12. So, we are kind of used to seeing the switch statement as a series of if then else construct, kind of. So, this has changed with Java 12. Now, it is an expression which can return a value, and probably in one of the future versions of Java, we would be able to define our methods like this. So, you would be aware about with the lambda expressions with Java 8. So, we define lambda expressions in a similar format. We would be able to define our methods also like this. And coming to you in a future release of Java, I present to you seal types. So, we could be talking about entities where you can define which of the interfaces or classes could extend your entities. And I mentioned that we are talking about multiple small features. So, are there any stages related to those features? Yes, they are. When we are talking about Java, which is quite an old language. So, any feature should be thought about, discussed, worked on by a lot of professionals, and it should be a well thought out feature and implementation. So, there are multiple stages, as you can see. It goes to the draft state, submission, candidate, propose to target, and then eventually it goes to the closed or the delivery state. So, that is the usual flow, but as you can see, at any stage it could be dropped as well. If the folks at Oracle, they understand that the feature is not working as it's supposed to be, or the developers submit their feedback back to Oracle and it's not working as was planned, it could be withdrawn, closed, or dropped. And in recent history, one of the features which was about to be delivered was withdrawn. One went a lot of changes. If you have heard about raw strings in Java, so that was changed a lot. Now it has taken a new avatar with text blocks. Enhanced enums has been on hold, and a lot of changes. So, my point is that there are a lot of stages which are attached to each language changes, and it could be withdrawn at any stage. And they are release dates attached with some of them, not all of them. So, some of the features that I would be talking about today have been released in recent versions of Java, and some do not have a release date yet, because they would be given a release date as they go closer to the completion, because as I mentioned, they could be taken off at any stage. So, we are not talking about any specific release dates for a lot of features. So, I hope we all agree with this statement, change is constant, right? How many of us agree with this statement? Whether we want it or not, change will happen, right? Change is beautiful. How many of us agree with this statement? Yes. And of course, we all know that if we don't change, then in short form, we will perish. So, that's important. How many of us agree with this statement? Change is painful. Ouch! Because I couldn't use the other word, right? So, I'm here to kind of walk you through the steps or give you a perspective of what's coming in Java, what's new, because change is beautiful, it's constant, it's inevitable, but it is painful. And how to make things less painful is that you should be knowing about it. When you foresee things, when you know what's coming, you are comfortable, then the change is less painful. Right. So, in today's session, I would be covering all these Java features. I would not say them aloud now, we will cover them as we go through the session. So, I'll start with type inference with var. So, as I mentioned earlier, with Java 10, I do not need to use explicit data types with my local variables. I could use the reserved word var, and the compiler would be able to infer the type for us. Before I move forward, what is type inference? When I say the compiler would be able to infer the type, let's make sure that we are on the same page with the understanding what type inference is. So, this is a jigsaw puzzle, and in the next slide I will show you a shape of the missing piece. I hope you would be able to recognize. Will this one fit? No. Will this one fit? No. Will this one fit? So, you were able to infer which piece would be the best fit given the information I already had in the slides. Same thing applies to the code that you write in Java using type inference with var. You provide all the code which is required for the compiler to infer the type of your local variable. So, let's see a couple of examples here. Okay, so I go to type inference with var. Let me define a couple of variables. So, let's start with string, name is Java is everywhere, right? And then I have my local date time, then I initialize it to local date time dot now, and then I create a hash map of let's say string, and the value type is integer. Okay, then I just say new hash map, right? Now, so all these are local variables. So, one of the ways to convert them is that I just select this and I replace that with var, right? Now, what if I do that here? So, this is a hash map. So, hash map is a collection class in Java which takes with this one I have specified that the key would be of type string and the value would be of type integer. So, I could limit what type of values I could pass to it, but when I do this, I could say map dot put, and I could have the value as, let's say, string and integer, and I could do the other way around as well. So, this should not happen, but of course, as you can see, this one is valid. So what happened? What went wrong? So let's go back and see what we had earlier and what we are left with now. So this is what we had earlier, right? So all the type information about the data that goes in this collection was included on the left side of the equal sign, but when I replace that with var, it was lost. So ideally that should move to the right. So let me do that. So now when I try to add values which are not valid, it would not be possible. So that we go back to the initial explanation. So what remains in the code should have all the information so that the compiler can infer the type of your variables. With the earlier line of code that we had, we were working with raw types where we don't have the information about the type that goes in the collection. And let's have let's say I type age is equal to null. Do you think this will work? No, it won't, because again I do not give all the information to the compiler to infer the type. Again, if I do this, this will not work as well. So this is how I explain this. If you don't give all the information, the compiler would not let you in with var. Again, let's say I have a variable result and I want to assign to it a value 9.8, and in Java the type could be float or double, right? And a lot of time, even if you asked a lot of experienced programmers what the type would be, they would take, let's say, a second, 2 or 5 to kind of come up with an answer. Why do we want to waste all that time? Why not delegate that to the compiler? I can simply say var result is 9.8. So those are kind of benefits that you get when you use var with your local variables, because methods are the ones that we are working with so often, and local variables are, of course, we need those in our methods. So we could delegate that part to the compiler. And yes, Java is still statically typed language. We are not moving towards dynamic typing. Once a line of code like this executes, the type is inferred by the compiler and it is defined. You can't assign, let's say, a string to your variable result in the next line. So we are still a statically typed language. Just in case if you have any doubts, you can ask your IDE. So here you can see on the upper right, it shows you the exact type. So this is just a simple case. So let's say if we talk about method chaining, if I say dot concat, I say Singapore, then I say substring, and then I say 4, I say index of, then I say let's take 3. What do you think is the return type here? Int, string, char, maybe, right? Again, why are we trying to waste our time on things which compiler can infer? So that's the benefit of using var with your local variables. So you could simply say var return or let's say data is equal to your expression, and if you go to the documentation, you can see that the return type is an int. So that's how it helps. And again, if we try to define our arrays using var, we need to make sure that all the information which is remaining has the relevant information, because using var is not about chopping off your explicit data types and replacing that with var. No, that doesn't work. So quickly a look at where you can and you can't use var. So var could be used for local variables, and these are the places where you can define your local variables. Interestingly, the static initializer blocks that you have in your code is also the variables that go in there, those are local variables. So, you could use var there as well. Of course, we talk about constructors, if constructs, loops and the other ones. So, a quick check, not sure whether, because we do not have a lot of Java developers, so I would just let you know the answers. If we go from the bottom, you cannot use var with the method parameters, that does not work because it is not a local variable, and you cannot also use var with your exception handlers variable. And this one's interesting because the first line of code, even though it seems quite correct, it will not compile, because we are talking about an int literal value where the type, the value would not fit in as an int value. So, it cannot be assigned to counter which would be inferred as int. So, because there is a mismatch, it will not compile. Of course, the second line of code compiles because the literal has been casted to a long value, so then it works. So, the second line of code, compiler infers the type as long, and that is okay. And the third line is you can use explicit casting with var. So, all these rules were already there ever since Java was there. So, it is only the developers who need to be more aware about these rules. So, the compiler says, okay, I already know what the rules are. So, developers need to be better prepared about using new features and new versions. I will quickly touch up on using type inference with derived classes. So, that is a typical example where I have a parent class and a child class, and one method in the parent class, two methods in the child class. And if I have a variable of type which uses var, and I assign it to it an instance of child, the type would be inferred as child, right. So, now let me change that a little bit. Now, I define a method where the return type is the parent class, and the type of object which is returned by the method depends on the value that I pass to the method. Now, if I create a variable using var, no matter what value I pass to it, the type of obj would always be parent, because that would depend on the method signature of method get object. So, again, as developers we just need to brush up our understanding the basics on Java. So, that was about using var with local variables in Java 10. So, I will cover local variable syntax for lambda parameters in Java 11. So, since you already mentioned that you have been working with lambdas in Java 8, so type inference with your parameters has already been there, right. So, what is it? Okay, so let me quickly, right. So, let me define a lambda. I say it takes a value of type integer, and the name of my lambda parameter is function. I say when I give it a value x, it should return me if x is not equal to null, and if x is greater than, let us say, 12. Now, this is a lambda parameter. Now, let me just copy this one and I have it here, right. So, I could type my lambda parameter as in here, or I could change it like this. I could add var to it starting with Java 11, or I could type the explicit type which is integer, right. So, would you know if these all of these lambdas are of the same time, or are we talking about multiple types of lambdas? So, interestingly, they are the same types. It is how one type could be written in the other form, But since we are talking about different forms here, a lot of programmers, they get confused whether we are talking about the same types of lambdas or are we talking about different types or the same types. So, they all are the same. So, it is just that we are taking off information from one type to the other. So, this could be written as this, which could be written as this, and eventually the compiler would get this one. And the benefits of adding var to the lambda parameters is that we are aligning ourselves to usage of var which was introduced in Java 10. And the other benefit is you can also use your annotations here, because what happened? Annotations are not allowed. Let me check. So, this is, oh, right, sorry. So, I can also use my annotations with the method parameters now. If I wanted to use method annotations with the lambda parameters, previously I would have to figure out the exact type and then write the missing type and then use the annotations, but now I could do that with var. Now, let me move on to the switch expressions. So, we are talking about, let us say, so how many of us were at the leadership summit yesterday? Okay, so we know about learning Lola, right? So, now we'll talking about littering Liam. So, that is a person who kinds of loves to litter around. So, we have an enum for him. So, I have an enum single use plastic which has a couple of constants and then a method which is get damage to planet. So, whenever you use a single use plastic item, of course you are doing some damage to the planet. So, let us find out what is the damage. Okay, so right. Okay, so if I say, if I am using spoon, I say the damage is, let us say, what is happening? It is too cold here. The damage is, let us say, 12 points. Then I have to break out, and then I say if I am using, no, if Liam is using, right? If it is cup, then the damage is, let us say, 10 points, and then again I break out of the loop, and then I say case bottles. So, that is the most damage which is happening because we are using so much of plastic bottles. So, let us say the damage is 50 points here, and I break out of the loop, and then we have just one value, and then I say damage is, let us say, 3 points. Again, the break statement is mandatory. So, this is how we are used to writing our switch statements, and this is how the damage is being done, right? Now, if you can see, what we are doing is we are repeatedly using the break statement. What happens if I do not use the break statement? The control falls through the next case label, which introduces a logical error. The other thing is I am using so much of code. Third thing, I am assigning value to a variable. So, essentially I could get away with all of that by converting that to a switch expression. Now, in this case, I could use this expression to return a value. Earlier, I could use it only to execute a set of statements which included assigning value to variables. Now, what happens if I just take off, let us say, this line of code? In this case, the code will not compile because I am talking about returning a value, and if I am not able to address all the values that could be passed to my variable plastic, then it will not work because I need to address the exhaustive list of values that could be assigned to plastic. So one of the ways to do that is to of course have all the case labels. Of course I deleted one of them. The other one is I could insert the default label. If I do that, it would be taken care of. Let's say, okay, so right, and now in this case, okay, let me change the value. And what happens if I have this? So this one is interesting. I can also merge my case labels. So with the older switch statements, you could only have one case label in one switch branch. Now you could also merge your labels, and this is an enum where we can define an exhaustive set of case labels to kind of figure out what's happening with each one. But if you're talking about switching on values like int, string or others where we don't have an exhaustive list, then having a default there is compulsory, so that we are returning a value in every case. And this is not limited to defining just one value. You could have a block of statement. So instead of having 50 here, I could have a block of statement. I could say I'm defining a variable. I say let's data is 10. I could even go out for a walk, but I must return a value, and the keyword to return the value is yield. So this is how I could return value from a block. Of course, I don't need the semicolon here. And it's not only about returning the values, you could also define a regular block of statement the way you have been using with your old switch constructs, and those are not going away. So don't worry. So we talk about text blocks which are coming with Java 13, which is releasing in September, which is next month. So we are at 31st August. So next month we would see a new version of Java, which is 13. So what do we do with a switch? Why do we even need multi-line string values? I have a long string here and which I can't read. So what do? I just split that one into multiple lines, right? So that's one of the usages of having multi-line string values. But that's not the only thing I need with string values, because a lot of time I would be storing my HTML data or JSON values or XML values, database queries in multi-line strings. So how do I do that? So let's say I have this block of code, and let me go back and let me define a local variable. I say my HTML is equal to this. So even though my editor is helping me to write the code without me manually inserting all those plus and opening and closing quotes and the new line tabs, it's still difficult for me to read the code, right? And it becomes even more difficult if, say, we are talking about JSON data. So let's say I have this one, and I go back and I say string JSON is equal to, and I would just assign the value that I copy pasted, and this is how it works. Oh, so by the way, the shortcuts could be seen at the bottom. I'm so sorry, I missed stating that in the beginning. So I would be using a lot of shortcuts, so you could see them at the bottom of the screen. Again, this would help us to write the code quickly. Again, I could not read that easily. So what happens with text blocks? I could define my, let's say we have a new version which is JSON 2, and instead of double quotes I have 3 double quotes, and this is how it would work in Java 13 now. So I don't need all those concatenation operators, I don't need the new line characters, I don't need to have all that clutter, and this is much more readable. And of course, if you are working with an IDE like IntelliJ IDEA, you can get more help by modifying your multi-line string values, because what do we do with multi-line string values? You need to edit them, you need to work with them. So, let us say if I talk about this piece of code, I could say inject this with the language or reference. Here it's JSON, and I say yes, and I could also edit this one easily. So, now I get a new window where I could easily edit this one. And by the way, this one works with any version of Java which you are working on, because that's a feature. Editing part is by the IDE, not by the language itself. Okay, so now, okay, so we've already done this. So now, so these were the features which have already been released or would be released next month. So now let's quickly talk about some of the new features which we would see in future releases of Java. So let me talk about records. How many times, so what happens, let's say all of you are given the same size of trousers. It would fit some, just a few. It would be small for a lot, big for a lot of you, and it would take a lot of time and effort to get them altered and to have them be of your size. And this is what is happening when we use the same class to define all our types of classes. So, we have been using classes to define, we used to define enums using the same pattern earlier, before enum was added to the language, and we have been using classes like your data carrier classes, something like your EMP, where you just need information about an employee just to save it to your database or to send it over the network. But what happens? So, let us say I have an EMP class like this. Okay. What's happening? Okay. This is strange. I got it. Okay, now I know. This is funny. Okay. So, if I have an EMP class like this, and if I have just two variables, I could insert code. I could say generate constructor for me, and I could say, let us say, generate the equals and hash code for me, and I could also generate the getters and setters. But again, the same thing is, if let us say I could modify this line of code, again the IDE could help me generate a lot of code there, but again it would be on the developer side to read all that code. And when you, even if you manage to wade through all the code just to understand that okay, this is just a carrier for your data, there could be some modifications by the developers which are hard to detect. So, what's the solution? Here it is. Instead of having all the responsibility on the developers, how much time? Okay, I'll quickly wind up. So, instead of having developers do all the heavy weightlifting, why not move it to the language itself? So, with records, Java is adding support to define your data classes, and that would be as simple as doing this. And behind the scenes, the compiler would do all the work for you. It would compile, insert the code, relevant methods, and you won't have to do that, and that would help you in reading the code. And records, the changes to the Java language specifications are already added to the changes with records have already been added to the Java language specifications. They are still in draft, and this is a work in progress. the slides are already up at the Women Who Code website, so you could check out the slides and you will be able to get this link. And of course, this is a work in progress and it can change without notice. So, seal types I already mentioned. You kind of have a cap on which entities can extend your classes or interfaces. So, that is another level of encapsulation we are having for our members or entities now. Concise method bodies. So, this is how you are used to writing your methods, and that could change to this, and this would apply to single line methods, and if applicable you could use method references instead of lambdas, the way we use string colon colon and then the method name. So, that would work as well. Now, this one is interesting, pattern matching. So, let us say, okay, so instead of demo I would quickly go through this one. Let us say if we have a class ocean and we talk about having an object, how do you extract the members and use them? The first one is that you use the instance of operator, then you cast it to that particular class, or you create a variable, cast it, and then you get to the values. Again, as developers we know what is the second step after we try to test whether an object is of a certain type. If we are testing, the second step is an obvious casting or declaring a variable. So, why not take it off? And how many of us just kind of have to count the number of round braces, right? So, we can of course get away with that one. So, this is another way of writing the same code in which instead of directly casting we are defining a new variable. But with pattern matching we can have something like this, where I say object instance of ocean and then I have a new variable which would be casted automatically to your OBJ, so that you do not have to do the casting. So, again the Oracle is taking load off the developers and taking it to the compiler. So, this is the difference that you would have in the older one and the new instance of operator, which comes with pattern matching. So, this one is currently on hold. So, this is how we have been writing our enums with a set of constants. And did you know that you could also add code to your enums? You could define methods and variables which are applied to all the methods, to all the constants, and you could define members and variables which apply to individual constants. So, that is also possible. So, the one in red is applicable only to the constant medium, but if you try to access that, it will not work, because the compiler cannot see the ones which are specific to a constant. That goes the way we define anonymous class. So, we do not know the name of the anonymous classes. So, has anyone tried decompiling their code and they notice some classes with a suffix $1, $2, something like that? So, those are the anonymous classes. When compiler compiles those classes, those are compiled to full-fledged classes and they have a prefix suffix like that. But as developers we can't use those names in our code, because we never know what exact suffix the compiler uses. The same logic applies here. So, perhaps if we get enhanced enums, we would be able to add type parameters to our enums like this, and probably with that we would be able to access the members which are specific to enum constants, and you would be able to code something like this. So, I would quickly go through. So, this is the message that I would like you to take from the session, that the change is constant no matter if we want it, if we do not want it, we have to embrace it, and to make that change less painful we should be aware about what is happening, all the trends. So, embrace it. Thank you very much. Sorry, come again. I could hear you.
Sorry, I was a little bit late to the session, so maybe this was talked about earlier. But in the kind of ending section about changes to pattern matching coming, are there plans to build even more extended pattern matching beyond, say, just checking for instance of assigning the variable right there? Are there more plan changes from, say, pattern matching?
Yes, they are. So this the pattern matching that which I talked about has been toned down, let's say, to 25%. So there were a lot of use cases which were included. So we were talking about matching multiple types in one case label. So it was also extended to switched expressions, but it was taken off due to some problems. As I'm not sure whether you attended the part where I mentioned that a lot of times. So this is in works at Oracle. So when they are working on some features, if they hit some roadblock, they might take it off, or they might put that part on hold or complete feature. So yes, they are working on it, and this is just the part which has been made public to us. Yeah.
And then I guess a quick follow-up question, more of a meta question about just changes in Java in general.
Right.
Do you find that, what are the biggest roadblocks to making these language level changes? Is it making sure that tooling is compatible, or just backwards compatibility in general? I've noticed there's a bigger rate of changes in Java recently, so I'm wondering if something's changed.
Probably you'll have to repeat the question. I missed the first part of this question.
Oh, sorry. So I was just wondering, I've noticed, more broadly speaking, I've noticed a higher rate of change
Right.
within the Java language.
Right.
In recent months.
Right.
What's changed at Oracle, or in development process, or design considerations? Just want to hear some color on that.
Okay, so the biggest change has been the rate at which the changes are delivered to the developers. So earlier Oracle had delivery rate of the difference between the two version releases was around 3 to 4 months, 3 to 4 years, and now it's 6 months. So the rate of innovation is the same, but now new changes can get to the developers every 6 months. So the new features which are ready, they are released to the developers, and the ones which are not. So earlier what used to happen was, even if the features were ready, they had to wait for a major feature to get ready, because earlier the releases were feature based and not time based, but now it's time based and not feature based. Yeah.
Any more questions? Thank you so much, Mala. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming here for the session today. Thank you.
And here is a cute little question.